Good evening. I was reviewing this script when one detail stopped me cold. The protagonist filed a single government form 18 months before her sister's career collapsed. And then she simply waited. No confrontation, no revenge plot, just the machinery of financial regulation, running exactly as designed. You're watching Eternal Diary. The smell that Mara Solis associated with fraud was coffee gone cold. Not stale, not burned, cold. The specific dead flat temperature of a cup abandoned at a desk because the numbers on a screen had demanded too much attention for too long. She had been 14 hours into a vendor reconciliation that November night at Meridian Capital Group when the smell first registered. And when she finally reached over and touched the ceramic rim of her mug, the liquid inside was room temperature. The same temperature as the air in the empty 11th floor. The same temperature as the slow dread beginning to move through her chest. The numbers did not add up. Not in the approximate way that most finance floors tolerated, the rounding errors and category mismatches and the occasional transposition that administrative staff caught before end-of-quarter close. This was a different animal entirely. Mara had spent 6 years building her capacity to distinguish between sloppiness and intent, and what she was looking at had the clean, deliberate fingerprints of intent. Meridian Capital Group operated as a mid-tier private investment firm with assets under management hovering around $4 billion. Their clients were pension funds, university endowments, a handful of family offices with more money than patience, the kind of clients who expected precision and received it, or believed they did. The operations floor was small, 40-something people who managed the administration, compliance, and internal accounting infrastructure that kept the investment side of the business functional and auditable. Mara was a senior financial analyst in internal audit, which meant her job was to find the cracks before regulators did. She was very good at this. The vendor reconciliation that she had started that morning as a routine quarterly task had, by early afternoon, produced a small and unremarkable anomaly. 3 vendor payments in the same week, each under the $50,000 threshold that would require dual authorization, each routed through a vendor account that had been created within the past 14 months. She had flagged similar patterns before. Sometimes it was legitimate, a new contracted service spun up quickly for a project need, the paperwork trailing slightly behind the operational urgency. She had written the note, scheduled a follow-up, and moved to the next item on her list. It was the follow-up 2 days later that had sent her back to her desk at 7 in the morning and kept her there until now. Pinnacle Administrative Consultants, LLC. That was the vendor name on the 3 payments from that first week. She had pulled the vendor setup documentation. Articles of organization for an Illinois LLC filed 14 months ago. A single contact email at a Gmail address. A phone number that rang to a generic voicemail. Normal enough for a small consulting firm. Slightly unusual for a vendor of Meridian Capital's regulated caliber, but not impossible. She had searched the tax ID in the IRS database, cross-referenced their compliance department maintained. It existed. She had then done what she always did, which was to go backward, to pull every payment ever made to this vendor since its creation. 41 payments. $1,382,000. Each payment under $50,000. Each payment hitting the account of Pinnacle Administrative Consultants, LLC within 1 to 3 business days of an invoice submission. The invoices themselves, she had pulled 8 of them from the document management system, described services with the vague magnificence typical of firms that build for things like strategic operational consulting and executive advisory integration without ever specifying deliverables. She had searched the internal project tracking system for any project codes associated with those invoices. Nothing. Not mismatched, not archived, not closed, nothing. There was no internal documentation anywhere within Meridian's systems that connected the work described in those 41 invoices to any operational project, any client engagement, any internal initiative. Over $1 million paid for work that had, according to every internal record she could access, never been assigned, never been tracked, and never been completed. She opened a second browser tab and searched Pinnacle Administrative Consultants, LLC in the Illinois Secretary of State's business search tool. The filing was there. Registered agent. a registered agent service company in Chicago's Loop, the same kind of anonymous registered agent setup that thousands of legitimate businesses used, and that also served as an elegant buffer between a fraudulent shell company and the person who actually owned it. She searched the attached annual reports. The sole officer listed was a name she did not recognize: Margaret T. Holloway. She wrote the name down. Then she opened the accounts payable system and pulled the bank account on file for Pinnacle Administrative Consultants. She did not have the ability to see the full account number. Nobody in internal audit did, by design. But she could see the routing number, the bank name, and the partial account suffix. She wrote those down too. Then she did something she would not explain to anyone until much later. She opened her desk drawer, removed a personal USB drive that she had brought from home 6 months ago after a seminar on internal controls, and copied the vendor master file, the payment history, the invoice images, and the vendor setup documentation to the drive. She labeled the file with that day's date and a random 4-digit number that meant nothing to anyone but her, dropped it into her bag, and then continued working. She already understood, in the way that people who have spent enough years inside institutions understand, that the next step she took would determine everything that came after it. Institutions are not designed to welcome the discovery of their own rot. They are designed to preserve themselves. The people she would need to report to, the Chief Audit Officer Marcus Webb, and above him the CFO Victor Hale, were the same people whose departments managed vendor setup and payment approval. Victor Hale had final authorization authority over all vendor accounts above $10,000. His signature, or the electronic equivalent of it, appeared on the approved vendor list that included Pinnacle Administrative Consultants. She finished her coffee. She had already known it was cold. The next morning, she scheduled a meeting with Marcus Webb for that afternoon and spent the morning building a presentation she kept deliberately incomplete. She showed the anomaly: the pattern of sub-threshold payments, the lack of project documentation. She did not show everything she had. She did not mention Victor Hale's name. She said she wanted to escalate properly and needed his guidance. Marcus Webb listened to her with his hands folded on his desk, the way men of a certain temperament listen to information they have already processed before it is finished being delivered. He had a quality she had learned to read in her first month at Meridian, a particular stillness that was not patience, but its imitation. When she finished, he told her the documentation gap was likely a filing error, that operations was chronically behind on project code assignments, that he would review it and get back to her. He never got back to her. 3 weeks passed. She kept working. She added nothing to the vendor investigation in the official audit management system. She did her other assignments. She ate lunch at her desk. She watched Marcus Webb pass her door every morning without making eye contact, which was new. She watched the calendar and waited. On the 23rd day, she submitted her SEC whistleblower tip through the online portal at sec.gov/whistleblower. She had spent those 3 weeks learning exactly how the program worked. Section 21F of the Securities Exchange Act. The requirements for submission. What constituted original information, the confidentiality protections, the anti-retaliation provisions, the potential monetary awards, which ranged from 10 to 30% of sanctions, over $1 million if the information led to a successful enforcement action. She filled out Form TCR, tip, complaint, or referral, on her personal laptop, on her home internet connection at 11:30 at night, with a glass of water at her elbow and the television on low in the next room, so the apartment felt less like a sealed container. She described the ghost vendor scheme in specific technical language. She attached document images of the invoices, the vendor setup record, the payment history she had exported. She described the sub-threshold structuring pattern. She included the routing number, the bank name. She wrote the name Margaret T. Holloway and noted it was the registered officer of the Shell LLC, and likely a nominee used to obscure the true beneficial owner. At the end, in the section asking whether she wanted to remain anonymous, she checked no. She included her name, her contact information, her professional credentials, her CPA license number, her title at Meridian Capital Group. She submitted the form and sat for a long moment in the quiet apartment, listening to the heater tick. She had just crossed a line that only ran in one direction. She was not afraid, precisely. Fear implies uncertainty about an outcome. What she felt was something more like the specific gravity of a decision that has been made completely. The way a ship feels different once it has left the harbor. Not lighter, not heavier, just committed to a particular water. She went to sleep. The retaliation started 6 weeks later, which was 4 weeks faster than she had expected. The first sign was a meeting request from Marcus Webb and a woman named Cynthia Park from Human Resources, scheduled for a Tuesday morning, with a subject line that read, "Performance Discussion, Confidential." She had attended enough of those meetings, from the other side of the table, to know what they were. She had helped build the documentation for 3 of them over her tenure at Meridian, for employees whose departures had been decided before the meetings began. She went to the meeting with her phone set to record in her bag, and her expression arranged to neutral. Marcus Webb explained that over the past several months, there had been concerns raised about the quality and timeliness of her audit documentation. Cynthia Park slid a performance improvement plan across the table with the careful, rehearsed delicacy of someone who had done it enough times to stop enjoying it, but not enough times to stop being slightly uncomfortable. The PIP outlined specific documentation deficiencies. 3 reports flagged as late, 2 reports flagged as insufficiently detailed, and established a 90-day timeline for improvement with weekly check-ins. Mara read the PIP carefully. The 3 reports flagged as late had been submitted within the same week as 12 other reports from her colleagues, all of which had been accepted without comment. The 2 reports flagged as insufficiently detailed had received no feedback when submitted and had been closed as complete in the audit tracking system by Marcus Webb himself. She asked, in a measured tone, whether she could have copies of the specific feedback that had been provided on those reports at the time of submission, since her records showed they had been closed without comment. Marcus Webb told her the feedback had been communicated verbally. She said she would review the PIP and get back to them by end of week. She left the meeting, walked to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, walked through the revolving glass door, stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, and felt something that she did not allow herself to call rage, because rage implied a loss of control, and she could not afford any loss of control. She stood there for 4 minutes, watching a taxi navigate around a double-parked delivery truck, and then she walked back inside. That evening, she called a labor and employment attorney she had found through the Chicago Bar Association referral service, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who specialized in whistleblower retaliation. Sandra Okafor listened to everything she described, the SEC filing, the timeline, the PIP, and told her several things that mattered. First, the Dodd-Frank Act's anti-retaliation provisions prohibited employers from retaliating against employees who provided information to the SEC under Section 21F. The retaliation did not need to be directly connected to the filing by any evidence the employer produced. The temporal proximity between the filing and the adverse employment action was itself relevant. Second, she should not sign the PIP. Third, she should document everything. Fourth, she should assume that her communications on Meridian systems were being monitored and should conduct any sensitive communications through personal devices only. Mara thanked her, told her she had already done 3 of the 4 things, and asked her to send a retainer agreement. She did not sign the PIP. She submitted a written response to Cynthia Park that acknowledged receipt of the document, contested each specific claim with the documentary evidence that refuted it, and noted that she had retained legal counsel who would be in contact regarding potential retaliation concerns. She attached the submission confirmations from the audit tracking system, showing the closed status of the 5 flagged reports. The next 4 months at Meridian were a particular kind of quiet that people in institutions recognize when they are being erased. Her work was not reassigned outright. That was too obvious. It was redirected at the point of assignment, so that the interesting projects, the ones with complexity and visibility, went to colleagues, and she received the administrative tail ends of completed audits, the retrospective documentation work, the tasks that generated no profile and no influence. Her access to certain financial reporting systems was revoked, pending an access control review that was never formally concluded. She was removed from a cross-departmental working group with no explanation beyond a form email indicating that the group's composition had been adjusted. She kept working. She kept documenting. She kept her expression neutral. In April, a meeting was scheduled with Marcus Webb, Cynthia Park, and This was new. A man from the Office of the General Counsel whose name she did not recognize. It had a different subject line this time. Employment Status Review. Confidential. She went to that meeting knowing what it was as well, and came out of it 90 minutes later with a separation agreement that offered 4 months of severance in exchange for a full release of all claims against Meridian Capital Group, including any claims arising under Dodd-Frank. She took the agreement to Sandra Okafor, who told her, with the particular flatness of someone delivering accurate and unpleasant news, that the release clause attempting to waive her Dodd-Frank whistleblower rights was likely unenforceable, that this kind of overreach was common among employers whose legal teams wrote these agreements without fully understanding the scope of the statute, and that she had several options ranging from negotiating a higher severance to filing a retaliation complaint with the SEC directly. Mara listened to all of the options. She asked Sandra Okafor which option would do the most damage to Meridian Capital Group in the long run. Sandra Okafor paused for a moment, the pause of someone recalibrating their read of a client. Then she said, in terms of total enforcement outcome, the most damage would be done by not signing anything, maintaining her cooperation with the SEC investigation that was almost certainly now open on her tip, and waiting for the enforcement action to conclude. If sanctions exceeded $1 million, and given the dollar amounts involved they likely would, she was entitled to a whistleblower award from the SEC's Investor Protection Fund. That award would be paid by the government, not by Meridian, which meant no settlement with Meridian could touch it. And a whistleblower award from the SEC attached to a successful enforcement action would be a matter of public record. Mara said, "I'll need to think about the severance." She left Sandra Okafor's office and walked the 6 blocks to her apartment, and on the walk, she decided she would not sign the separation agreement. She would accept the termination, respond through Sandra with a letter asserting her rights and preserving her legal claims, and she would leave quietly. She would not file for unemployment immediately. She had savings. She would find another position. The morning after this decision, she checked her email and found a message from Aurelius and Crane Partners. She read it twice. Aurelius and Crane was a financial advisory and risk management firm with offices in Chicago, New York, and London. Their client base was institutional. Insurance groups, sovereign wealth fund subsidiaries, multinational corporate treasury departments. The email was from a recruiter named Daniel Foss, who explained that Aurelius and Crane were building out their forensic compliance practice and had identified Mara based on her publication record. She had written 3 technical articles for the Journal of Financial Crime over the past 4 years on fraud detection methodology in institutional settings, and her professional profile. They were looking for a director of forensic compliance. The compensation range was listed in the email, which was unusual, and which told her immediately that they were serious and in a hurry. It was 40% above her current salary. The position was everything she had been working toward. Director level, forensic focus, institutional clients. She read the job description 3 times with the careful attention she gave to financial documents, looking for the misrepresentation between what was written and what was real. And she found nothing that concerned her. The role was real. The firm was legitimate. The compensation was serious money. She wrote back to Daniel Foss that afternoon, from her work email because she was technically still employed until the end of her notice period, thanking him for the outreach and expressing her interest in learning more. She said she would follow up from a personal email address later that week. She should have followed up immediately. What she did instead? She was in the middle of what she understood to be one of the most legally sensitive periods of her professional life, with an active SEC investigation she was cooperating with, a potential retaliation claim she was preserving, and a separation from a major employer she was navigating. She wanted to be careful. She had a brief conversation with her mother that weekend, a Saturday call from her apartment while she was cleaning, half distracted, and she mentioned the email from Aurelius and Crane in passing. Told her mother that there was a very good job opportunity that had come up at an interesting time, and that she was figuring out her next steps. Her mother, Elena Solis, said, "That's wonderful, Mara. You deserve good things." Her sister Diane, who was at their mother's house that Saturday, and who Mara could hear in the background making noise in the kitchen, said nothing. Mara did not think about this. The follow-up she planned to send to Daniel Foss from her personal email address never went out. She got caught in the mechanics of the separation from Meridian, The document review, the correspondence with Sandra Okafor, the formal response to the termination letter, the transition of her work files, the final payroll calculation dispute she had to resolve. A week passed. Then another week. When she went to compose the email to Aurelius and Crane from her personal account, it occurred to her that she could not remember the recruiter's full name. She went back to her work email, which she could still access during the notice period, to find the original message. It was gone. Not moved to a folder, not archived. Gone. The work email was on Meridian's system, which she still had read access to during the notice period, and she could see the inbox, the sent items, the deleted items. The email from Daniel Foss was not in any of them. She checked the deleted items specifically, then the spam folder. She searched the recruiter's name. She searched the firm name. She searched her own sent items for the reply she had written. Nothing. She spent 20 minutes with this, the particular slow-motion feeling of looking at a space where something should be and finding it empty. Then she concluded that it was possible, likely even, that Meridian's IT team, in the process of preparing her account for closure, had purged certain categories of email, possibly including a personal recruiting inquiry that had come into her work address. It was plausible. It was the kind of thing that happened. She had given Daniel Foss her work email address. She had no way of reaching Aurelius and Crane without remembering more details than she currently had. She could not remember the full recruiter name, only the first name, Daniel. She spent an hour on LinkedIn searching Aurelius and Crane partners, and Daniel. She found Daniel Foss's profile and sent a connection request with a message explaining who she was, and that she had experienced a technical issue with her email and wanted to reconnect regarding the Director of Forensic Compliance opportunity. Daniel Foss accepted the connection 3 days later and sent her a message that said, "Hi Mara, thanks for reaching out. We've actually recently moved through the process and extended an offer on this role. The candidate we selected had a very strong background in institutional forensic compliance. We may have future opportunities in the practice area. I'll keep you in mind." She read this message on a Tuesday morning, standing in her kitchen in yoga clothes she had put on with the intention of going for a run that she had not yet taken. Holding her phone with one hand and her coffee with the other, and the feeling that moved through her was not quite identifiable in real time. It was something between confusion and a very quiet alarm. The kind that does not ring loudly, but simply begins and continues without stopping. The role had been filled. Someone had been hired for the Director of Forensic Compliance position at Aurelius and Crane Partners, a role she had been directly recruited for. A role that aligned precisely with her credentials and her publication record. A role she had been specifically targeted to fill, while she had been occupied with the mechanics of leaving Meridian Capital Group and had failed to follow up. She set her coffee on the counter. Then she thought about the email that had disappeared. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about the fact that the reply she had sent from her Meridian work email to Daniel Foss at Aurelius and Crane, the reply she had written and sent that had shown in her sent items before she stopped checking, was also gone. If the email had simply been purged from her inbox as part of an IT cleanup, the sent reply should still exist as an outgoing communication associated with her account. But neither was there, which meant either both had been removed deliberately or her memory of sending a reply was mistaken. She was almost certain she had sent a reply. She went to her personal Gmail account. She searched for any emails from Aurelius and Crane or Daniel Foss. Nothing. She had never received an email at her personal address from them because she had not yet sent them her personal address. She had planned to, and then the noise of the Meridian separation had closed over that plan, and now someone else had the job. She told herself, it happened. Move forward. She applied for 3 other positions that week, updated her LinkedIn profile, scheduled coffee meetings with 2 colleagues from her professional network, and began drafting a consulting services outline. She had enough saved to take 3 or 4 months. She was fine. 2 months later, she ran into her friend Keisha at a professional networking event hosted by the Illinois CPA Society. Keisha worked in compliance at a downtown law firm, and they had been in the same cohort for their CPA certification years ago. They stood near the back of the room, with wine neither of them was particularly interested in drinking, and caught up the way people do at these events, efficiently and with real affection underneath the efficiency. Keisha asked how things were going since Meridian. Mara said fine, building her consulting practice. Keisha said she had heard Mara had landed a big role at Aurelius & Crane, which was a great firm. Mara went very still. She said, "Where did you hear that?" Keisha looked slightly uncertain, the way people look when they have inadvertently stepped on a conversational wire. She said she had seen something on LinkedIn, or maybe heard it from someone. She wasn't sure. She had just remembered hearing that Mara had moved to Aurelius & Crane in a director capacity. Mara said, "I'm not at Aurelius & Crane. Can I ask where specifically you saw that?" Keisha took out her phone. She searched for a minute, scrolled, then turned the screen toward Mara. The LinkedIn profile was for Diane Solis, her sister. The profile listed her most recent position as Director of Forensic Compliance at Aurelius & Crane Partners, Chicago. Start date 3 months ago. Education, DePaul University. CPA licensed. The professional summary was 3 paragraphs long and contained, with extremely minor word substitutions, the exact language of Mara's own LinkedIn profile summary. The language she had written herself, revised and refined over 3 years. The language that described her specific approach to institutional fraud detection, her focus on forensic methodology in regulated financial environments, her publication and speaking history. Mara handed the phone back to Keisha with a steady hand. She excused herself from the conversation with the right words in the right order and walked to the bathroom, and stood at the sink with the cold water running over her wrists, and looked at the tile wall and thought with a clarity that felt chemical, surgical, like anesthesia wearing off in reverse. Not pain arriving, but awareness arriving about the particular shape of what had just happened. Her sister had taken her job. Not metaphorically, not competitively. She had taken the specific job that Mara had been recruited for at the specific firm that had reached out to Mara. And she had done it by presenting herself as someone with Mara's credentials, Mara's publication record, Mara's professional profile, and the professional summary Mara had written. She had taken the initial recruiter email from Mara's work account, or accessed it through some other means, and had responded to it in Mara's place, and had then gone to the interview and had gotten the job, which meant she had used Mara's CPA license number on her materials, because Diane did not have a CPA license. Mara knew this with certainty. Diane had started the CPA process once, several years ago, and had stopped partway through, and had never completed it. The water was very cold. Mara turned it off. She stood there and thought about Aurelius & Crane's background check process. Every regulated financial services firm conducted pre-employment background verification. The question was the depth. Some firms used basic services: criminal history, employment dates, education verification. Others, particularly those with institutional clients who were themselves subject to regulatory oversight, used comprehensive verification services that included professional license verification, regulatory database checks, adverse media searches. The quality of the background check entirely depended on the firm and the vendor they used. Diane was currently employed at Aurelius & Crane in a director-level forensic compliance role. The background check had apparently not caught whatever she had submitted, either because the check had not been thorough enough, or because she had been careful. Or, Mara thought, because the check had not yet run its full course when the offer was made, and any follow-up issues had been quietly managed. She thought about this for a long time. Then she thought about the other thing. Diane had worked at Meridian Capital Group. Not in Mara's department. Diane had been in accounts payable administration. She had been hired at Meridian 2 years before Mara, through a contact in the operations department, doing invoice processing and vendor payment coordination. When Mara had joined the firm a year later in a different division, they had maintained a careful professional distance that was their habit everywhere. They were not close, in the manner of sisters who love each other from a specific and understood distance. And the workplace had simply extended that distance with the additional formality of professional context. But Diane was in accounts payable administration. Mara stood at the bathroom sink in the Illinois CPA Society event venue and felt the architecture of it lock into place with the slow, irreversible precision of tumblers in a safe. Diane worked in accounts payable. She processed vendor invoices. She had access to the vendor payment system. The ghost vendor scheme? Pinnacle Administrative Consultants, 41 payments, $1,382,000 had required someone inside accounts payable to process the invoices, without flagging the lack of project documentation, without questioning the sub-threshold structuring, without triggering any of the normal operational alarms that should have caught a vendor billing for non-existent work. Mara had not looked at the accounts payable approval chain when she had been building her original evidence file. She had been focused on the vendor master record, the payment history, the invoice content. She had been looking at what was being paid, not who had approved each payment to be processed. She had not followed the operational thread backward from the payment to the person who had keyed it into the system. She had been thorough. She had not been complete. She went back out to the event. She made 20 more minutes of conversation. She said goodbye to Keisha with a specific warmth designed to leave the exchange feeling normal. She drove home. She made tea. She opened her laptop. She had copies of everything. The USB drive from that night in the Meridian office copied to an encrypted file on her personal cloud backup at the time she had taken it. She opened the payment history file and, for the first time, looked at the field she had never focused on. Processed by. The field that captured the system user ID of the accounts payable staff member who had keyed each invoice into the payment queue. 41 payments. 37 of them had been processed by user ID AP-0047. She opened the internal staff directory she had saved as part of her original document backup. She had exported it the same night as everything else, not knowing exactly why, operating on the principle that more documentation was always better than less. She searched AP-0047 in the exported directory. The user ID was registered to Diane L. Solis, Accounts Payable Coordinator 2. Mara closed the laptop. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed for a while. Not to calm herself down, she was already calm, in the specific subterranean way of people who have just received information that confirms a fear so deeply held it was not consciously articulated until the confirmation arrived. She breathed because she needed to think with precision, and precision required oxygen. Her sister had not merely stolen her job. Her sister had been a participant in the fraud that had destroyed her career. Diane had processed the fraudulent invoices. She had been the operational mechanism through which Victor Hale, or whoever was on the receiving end of those Pinnacle administrative consultants' payments, had moved money through the accounts payable system. Whether she had understood what she was doing, whether she had been coerced or compensated, or simply compliant, Mara did not know. What she knew was that Diane's user ID appeared on 37 of 41 fraudulent payments, and that when the SEC investigation had begun, triggered by Mara's whistleblower report, Diane had not been fired. Mara had been fired. Diane had quietly remained at Meridian through the investigation's early stages, and had then, at some point, relocated to Aurelius and Crane with Mara's stolen identity and credentials. The question that a different person might have asked was, why would Diane do this? Mara did not ask this question. She did not find it interesting. The architecture of motive, whether it was jealousy or desperation or the particular opportunism of someone who had always lived adjacent to a more capable sister and had finally seen a door left open, was not information she needed. She needed something more useful. She needed to understand the exact legal and procedural landscape she was standing in. She called Sandra Okafor at 8 the next morning. Sandra Okafor listened to everything without interrupting, which was one of the things Mara most valued about her. When Mara finished, there was a brief pause before Sandra spoke. Sandra said, "You understand that you cannot contact Aurelius and Crane directly at this point." Mara said, "I know." Sandra said, "And you understand that the moment you surface this publicly or confrontationally, Diane has the opportunity to create a narrative, muddy the documentation, and potentially damage your position with the SEC investigation." Mara said, "I know that too." Sandra said, "So tell me what you're thinking." What Mara was thinking had taken shape overnight, assembled piece by piece in the half-lit hours between 2 and 5 in the morning while she had lain in bed with the ceiling for company. It was not complicated. It was not elaborate. It was simply an understanding of the order in which things needed to happen, and what she needed to do, or refrain from doing, to allow them to happen in that order. She told Sandra, "The SEC investigation is active. I have cooperating witness status. The evidence I submitted, the payment history, the vendor records, has Diane's user ID on 37 fraudulent transactions. I did not include that detail in my original submission because I wasn't looking at it. I need to supplement my submission to the SEC with the accounts payable approval data. That's my first move." Sandra said, "That's a legitimate supplement to your tip under Section 21F. You can do that." Mara said, "Second, Aurelius & Crane is a financial advisory firm with institutional clients, which means it's registered with the SEC and subject to FINRA oversight. Any regulated firm in that category is required to conduct thorough background verification on personnel in compliance and risk roles. The Director of Forensic Compliance position would be subject to FINRA's background check requirements. If Diane submitted my CPA license number as her own, that is license fraud. If she submitted false employment history or educational credentials, that is additional fraud. These are not civil matters. They are reportable to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation and potentially to federal enforcement authorities." Sandra said, "You would not be the one making those reports. You would simply ensure that the people who have authority to make them have the information they need." Mara said, "Exactly." Sandra said, "And if Aurelius & Crane runs a thorough background verification that includes professional license confirmation through the IDFPR database, they will find that the CPA license number attached to Diane's credentials belongs to you, not her." Mara said, "Yes, but I don't know whether they've done that yet, or whether they will do it now." Sandra said, "You could trigger it." Mara said, "How?" Sandra said, "There are two ways. One, you could contact the IDFPR licensing board and report potential fraudulent use of your license number. They have an investigation process. Two, you could reach Aurelius & Crane's compliance or human resources team through a formal written inquiry. Not confrontational, not accusatory. Simply requesting to understand whether your credentials or license number have been associated with anyone else's application or employment record, framed as a professional license integrity concern. You would not name Diane. You would let their own verification process surface the problem." Mara thought about this. She said, "There's a third way. If the SEC investigation reaches the stage where they are subpoenaing employment records from Meridian Capital Group, which they will if they haven't already, those records will include the accounts payable system logs, which have Diane's user ID. And the SEC investigators will want to identify every person connected to the fraudulent transactions. They will contact Diane. And when they contact her about her employment at Meridian, they will learn that she is now working in a compliance role at a different regulated firm under false credentials. The SEC investigator can make a referral directly to the relevant regulatory bodies without my involvement at all." Sandra said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That is the cleanest path. It requires you to do very little." Mara said, "I know, but I need to supplement my SEC submission first, because the accounts payable user ID data makes the case significantly stronger, and I want it in the record." She supplemented her SEC submission that week. She wrote a precise, professionally formatted additional filing through the TCR portal, referencing her original submission number, attaching the accounts payable log export and the staff directory excerpt, and explaining the significance of user ID AP-0047 in the payment chain. She included a clear technical explanation of how the sub-threshold payment structuring, combined with the processing of invoices without project documentation, should have generated automated alerts in a properly functioning internal control environment, and that the failure of those alerts to generate any audit trail suggested either system override or manual intervention by someone with elevated system access. She sent the filing. She received an automated confirmation. She then closed the portal, made coffee, and went to her desk to work on the consulting engagement she had just picked up from a small private equity fund that needed help with their investor reporting controls. She did not contact Diane. She did not contact anyone at Aurelius & Crane. She did not post anything on LinkedIn. She did not call her mother. She did not tell anyone what she knew except Sandra Okafor and, 3 weeks later, the SEC attorney assigned to her case. The SEC attorney was a man named Henry Kwan. He had a calm, uninflected voice on the phone, and the habit of asking questions in very specific sequences that Mara recognized as the technique of someone who had spent a long time building evidentiary records. He called her on a Thursday afternoon while she was between meetings, and she stepped into her apartment hallway to take the call. Henry Kwan told her that the investigation was progressing and that her supplemental submission had been received and reviewed. He could not tell her the status of any specific investigative steps. He told her that her cooperation remained valuable and that she should continue to preserve all documentation she had in her possession. He asked her whether she was aware of any other current employees of Meridian Capital Group who might have information relevant to the investigation and who had not yet been interviewed. She told him about Diane, not about Aurelius and Crane, not yet. She told him about the accounts payable role, the user ID, the 37 payments, the fact that Diane was no longer employed at Meridian as of her last information. Henry Kwan said, "Can you confirm the full name and the last employment date?" She gave him what she had. There was a pause. She could hear the faint sound of typing. He said, "We'll be in touch." The months that followed had a texture she would later remember as one of the most purposeful periods of her professional life, which surprised her in retrospect, given the circumstances. She built her forensic consulting practice with the same methodical focus she had always applied to investigation work. She took on 3 clients in the first quarter: the private equity fund, a regional bank assessing its vendor controls, and a nonprofit whose board had asked her to review their financial reporting practices. She wrote another article for the Journal of Financial Crime, this one on whistleblower programs and their structural limitations in internal audit environments. The article was accepted and published 4 months after she submitted it. She had dinner with her mother twice during this period. Diane was not at either dinner. Her mother had the quality of people who prefer the surface of family relationships to the geological layers beneath, and Mara did not break this preference for her. Elena Solis talked about her garden, her neighbor's dog, a television series she was watching. Mara asked appropriate questions. She ate her mother's cooking and helped clear the table, and drove home through the city streets with the radio off. She thought about Diane occasionally, in the way you think about a calculation you have left running in the background. Not obsessively, not with the emotional heat that the situation might seem to warrant, but with the periodic check-in of someone who knows a process is in motion and wants to understand its current state. She thought about what Diane was doing every day at Aurelius and Crane, presenting herself as a forensic compliance director, with credentials she had borrowed from a sister she had already seen disappear from Meridian under a performance cloud. She wondered whether Diane understood the exposure she was carrying, or whether the passage of months had sanded down whatever anxiety she had started with into something manageable, something she had learned to live inside. The background check had apparently been sufficient to pass at the time of hire, or Diane had been clever about the credential fraud, submitted just enough documentation to satisfy a cursory check and enough of Mara's legitimate professional details to be plausible to someone who was not specifically looking for discrepancies. A name check would produce the right CPA license number because the license number was real, attached to a real person with real publications and a real professional history. As long as no one went back to confirm that the license number matched the current employee's social security number or date of birth or full legal name, the kind of deep verification that required the IDFPR to run a name-to-number reconciliation, the fraud would hold. It would not hold indefinitely. Nothing held indefinitely when it was built on someone else's foundation. Mara had been in her consulting practice for 7 months when a former colleague from the Illinois CPA Society, a man named Patrick Wen, who ran a small financial services compliance newsletter, called to ask if she would be willing to be quoted in an article he was writing about the growth of forensic compliance roles in institutional finance. He had been following her published work and wanted her perspective on the market trend. She agreed, did the interview by phone, and thought nothing of it. The article was published 6 weeks later. It was a trade publication piece, industry-focused, the kind of thing read by people in financial services, compliance, and risk management. It mentioned her by name, described her forensic consulting practice, and quoted her on trends in institutional fraud risk. It included her CPA license number in her professional byline, as she had approved in her review of the draft. She did not think about this detail at the time. She approved the byline, sent back the draft, and moved on to the next item in her day. She would think about it later. Aurelius and Crane Partners used Sterling verification services for their background checks. Sterling was a nationally recognized background screening company that served financial services clients, which meant their processes were calibrated for regulatory environments. Employment verifications, criminal history, credit checks for financial roles, professional license confirmation, adverse media searches, and, for senior compliance roles at SEC-registered firms, regulatory database queries that included FINRA's broker check, the SEC's Investment Advisor Public Disclosure Database, and state professional licensing systems. When Diane had been onboarded 7 months earlier, Sterling had run what the firm's standard engagement specified for a director-level compliance hire. The check had come back with no criminal history, confirmed employment dates at Meridian Capital Group, confirmed educational credentials at DePaul University, and a CPA license number that, when queried through the standard database, returned a valid, active license. The license holder's name in the IDFPR database was Mara L. Solis. Diane's submitted name on her application materials was Diane M. Solis. The discrepancy in the middle initial had been noted in the Sterling report and flagged for internal review. Aurelius & Crane's HR team had reviewed it and had accepted Diane's explanation that the middle name on her license reflected a legal name the firm had recorded, and that she went by a different version professionally. This was not an unusual enough discrepancy to hold up an offer at the time. What was unusual, and what created the cascade that Mara had been waiting for without knowing exactly when it would come, was the following sequence of events that occurred in the fall, approximately 9 months after Diane's start date at Aurelius & Crane. A new institutional client, a regional insurance holding company undergoing significant regulatory scrutiny from state insurance commissioners, retained Aurelius & Crane for a compliance advisory engagement that required enhanced due diligence on all personnel who would be involved in the engagement. The insurance holding company's own legal counsel required Aurelius & Crane to provide current background verification on all key personnel within the past 6 months. The director of forensic compliance was on the list of key personnel who would touch the engagement. Aurelius & Crane ran a refreshed Sterling background check on Diane Solis. This time, the check was triggered against a different scope: the enhanced due diligence package that Sterling ran for insurance regulatory contexts, which included an IDFPR professional license name-to-number reconciliation, rather than a number-only query. The reconciliation process compared the license number, the Social Security number, and the full legal name on file. The SSN attached to Diane's employment record did not match the SSN associated with CPA license number IL-XXXXX in the IDFPR database. The full legal name on the IDFPR record was Mara Lillian Solis, not Diane Marie Solis. The Sterling report flagged this as a credential discrepancy requiring resolution. There was a second flag in the refreshed report that had not appeared in the original. Sterling's enhanced package included a regulatory enforcement database search that cross-referenced pending SEC and FINRA investigative matters with employment history. The search returned a match: an open SEC investigation involving Meridian Capital Group, in which Diane Marie Solis, Accounts Payable Coordinator 2, was listed as a subject of inquiry related to potentially fraudulent vendor payment processing. Sterling delivered the refreshed report to Aurelius & Crane's Human Resources Department on a Wednesday morning. Mara did not know any of this was happening. She was in her apartment office working through a vendor control assessment for the regional bank client when her phone rang with a Chicago number she did not recognize. She let it go to voicemail, finished the paragraph she was writing, then picked up the voicemail. It was Daniel Foss, the Aurelius & Crane recruiter. He said he was following up regarding a professional credential verification matter and asked if she could return his call at her earliest convenience. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she called him back. Daniel Foss was careful and formal in a way that told her immediately he was following a protocol, probably with legal counsel on a parallel line or having reviewed a script with HR. He explained that Aurelius & Crane had become aware of a potential issue involving a professional credential, specifically a CPA license number, that appeared to be associated with Mara's name in the IDFPR records. He explained that the firm had a current employee whose background verification had returned information suggesting a possible connection to this license number, and wanted to confirm that Mara had not authorized any use of her CPA license number or professional credentials in connection with any job application at Aurelius & Crane. Mara said, I have not authorized any use of my CPA license number or any of my professional credentials in connection with any job application at your firm or anywhere else." There was a beat of silence on the line. Daniel Foss said, "I understand. Thank you for confirming that. Is there anything else you can tell us that might be helpful?" Mara said, "I'm happy to provide whatever documentation you need. I can send you my CPA license certificate, my IDFPR registration confirmation, and any other professional documentation that would help your verification process. I can also confirm that I was contacted by your firm approximately a year ago regarding this same director-level role, and that I never completed the interview process." Another beat of silence. She could hear him writing. He said, "We would appreciate that documentation. And I want to be transparent with you. This matter has been referred to our legal counsel, and there may be follow-up from that team." She said, "I understand. I'll send the documentation today." She sent it within an hour. Her CPA license certificate, the IDFPR registration confirmation with her full legal name and SSN-adjacent verification fields, and a brief cover note from Sandra Okafor's letterhead that confirmed Mara's professional credentials and noted that she was available to cooperate with any verification or legal process as needed. She did not ask Daniel Foss whether Diane was still employed at the firm. She did not need to. She poured herself a glass of water. She sat at the kitchen table where she had sat a year and a half ago, on the night she had looked at the accounts payable user ID field for the first time, and she thought about the way things move when you do not push them. She had filed a government form. She had supplemented it. She had let Henry Kwan's team work. She had done her job, built her practice, published her article, talked to Patrick Wen about industry trends, and approved her byline with her CPA license number in it. The byline that anyone looking for her professional identity would find. The byline that had perhaps been the document that triggered a search that made a connection that surfaced the discrepancy. She had not done that deliberately. She had simply been visible and legitimate, which was its own kind of strategy when the person you were waiting on had built their position on borrowed legitimacy. The legal counsel from Aurelius and Crane called her 3 days later. It was a woman named Rebecca Cho, a partner at the outside firm Aurelius and Crane retained for employment matters. Rebecca Cho was direct and efficient, and Mara liked her immediately for those qualities. She explained that Aurelius and Crane had conducted an internal review of the circumstances, had placed the employee in question on administrative leave pending resolution of the credential verification issues, and had made several regulatory notifications that were required under applicable law. She confirmed that the firm was cooperating with the relevant authorities, and thanked Mara for her prompt cooperation in the verification process. Mara asked, "Have you notified the SEC?" Rebecca Cho said, "I'm not able to discuss the specifics of notifications made to regulatory authorities." Which was, Mara understood, a confirmation that they had. Sandra Okafor called her that afternoon to say that she had received a communication indicating that the SEC investigative team was moving to a more active phase, and that there might be requests for additional documentation or interviews in the coming weeks. She said this in the measured tone of someone delivering good professional news without performing excitement, and Mara received it in the same register. She said, "Thank you, Sandra. I'll get you everything you need." What unraveled over the following weeks was not the dramatic, theatrical kind of collapse that people imagine when they imagine justice arriving. It was a procedural cascade, one institutional step triggering the next, each step generating documents that other institutions were required to review and act upon. It was paperwork and phone calls and notifications and the quiet, relentless movement of regulatory machinery that had been set in motion a year and a half ago, and had been running out of sight ever since. Victor Hale, the CFO who had designed the Pinnacle Administrative Consultants ghost vendor scheme and who had received the money in an account held by a nominee relative on his wife's side, was the primary target of the SEC investigation. The investigation had, in the months since Mara's original tip, built a case that included subpoenaed bank records connecting the Pinnacle account to Victor Hale's personal financial network, forensic accounting analysis of the invoice structuring pattern, and interviews with multiple Meridian employees about the internal control failures that had allowed the scheme to operate. Diane Solis had been interviewed by SEC investigators 7 months after Mara filed her supplemental submission, interviewed at Aurelius and Crane in a conference room without any advance notice that would have allowed her to prepare beyond what she had apparently already rehearsed. What Diane had told the investigators, Mara did not know and was not told. What she knew was that the SEC investigation produced an enforcement action that was filed in federal district court 14 months after her original whistleblower tip. The enforcement action named Victor Hale as the primary defendant and alleged securities fraud, misappropriation of client assets, and violations of Section 17A of the Securities Act and Section 10B of the Exchange Act. The complaint also named 3 other individuals: a Meridian operations officer, the nominee account holder, and Diane Marie Solis, accounts payable coordinator 2, described in the complaint as having knowingly processed fraudulent invoices and having facilitated the concealment of the scheme from internal audit procedures. Diane was a named defendant. The complaint was a public document. It was filed in the Northern District of Illinois and available through Pacer. Mara read it the morning it was filed, not because she was searching for it, but because Henry Kwan called her at 8:15 and told her the filing had gone through, and that her original tip had been materially significant to the case, and that she would be receiving formal correspondence regarding her potential whistleblower award calculation in the coming months. She thanked him. She put the phone down and opened the Pacer entry for the case, and read the complaint from beginning to end, sitting at her kitchen table in the early morning quiet with a cup of coffee at her elbow. The complaint was 46 pages, and it was precise and damning in the specific language of federal enforcement documents, language that has no emotional content but produces its effects exactly because of its absence. It described what Victor Hale had done in the language of statute and fact, and it described Diane's role in the same register. Solis processed 41 invoices from a shell entity designated by primary defendant Hale over a period of 14 months. Without generating audit documentation or internal control alerts consistent with standard accounts payable procedure, in a pattern consistent with knowing facilitation of the fraudulent payment scheme. Knowing facilitation. Mara read the phrase and set down her coffee cup. She had not known, when she had built her original evidence file in the Meridian office on that November night, what she would find when she finally looked at the user ID field. She had not known that the person whose signature ran through the fraudulent payment history was her sister. She had not known, when she had filed her SEC tip, that the same person who would use her stolen credentials to take her job was already implicated in the fraud she was reporting. She had not planned this. She had simply been thorough, which was its own form of violence in the right conditions. The credential fraud charges against Diane, the professional license misrepresentation, the false credential submission to a regulated financial employer, were handled separately through the Illinois Attorney General's office, which had received a referral from the IDFPR following Aurelius and Crane's notification. These were state charges, rather than federal, and they would move on a different timeline from the SEC enforcement action. Diane had been placed on administrative leave by Aurelius and Crane at the time the background check discrepancy surfaced, and had been terminated before the enforcement action was filed. Mara did not call her mother. She did not call Diane. She did not reach out through any channel to communicate anything about what was happening. The thing about silence, when it is strategic, is that it is not absence. It is a presence with different coordinates. She had been sitting with what she knew for a year and a half. She had lived with the knowledge of what Diane had done, the fraud facilitation, the stolen job, the borrowed credentials, and she had done the only thing that made sense to do with it, which was to put it precisely in the hands of institutions designed to respond to it, and then to live her life while they did. She had built her consulting practice. She had published her article. She had taken her clients through their assessments and written their reports and delivered her findings in the clear, precise language she had always used. She had not wasted a day of it. The whistleblower award notification from the SEC arrived as a formal letter 6 weeks after the enforcement action was filed. It explained the award calculation process, the applicable percentage range, and the factors the Commission would consider in determining the final award amount. Given the total sanctions sought in the enforcement action, which included disgorgement of approximately $1.4 million in fraudulent payments, plus substantial civil penalties against the primary defendant, and the weight of her original tip and supplemental submission in the case development, the preliminary award determination placed her in a favorable percentage range. She read the letter twice. She set it on the kitchen table. She picked up her phone and called Sandra Okafor. Sandra said, "I've been waiting for your call." Mara said, "It came." Sandra said, "How does it feel?" Mara thought about this question with the same attention she gave to questions worth thinking about. She looked out the window at the street below, at the afternoon light on the building across from hers, at a woman walking a dog on the sidewalk with the patient, unhurried quality of someone who has nowhere urgent to be. She said, "It feels like a number on a page that is a fair accounting of what things cost." Sandra said, "That's one way to put it." Mara said, "What do I need to do to respond to the letter?" What followed in the procedural chain was another kind of documentation. Forms, responses, the formal process by which the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower evaluated and determined the final award. Henry Kwan was replaced by a different contact from the Office of the Whistleblower, who walked her through the process with the same measured efficiency she had come to expect from the investigation side. She filed the relevant forms. She provided the requested documentation. She answered the questions put to her. The final award determination would take months. She knew this and planned accordingly, which meant she planned not around it at all, because it was not hers to control and was therefore not worth her management attention. She added a fourth consulting client, a private foundation that needed an annual financial controls review, and continued building. She was 3 months into the award process when her phone rang on a Thursday morning with Henry Kwan's number. She answered on the second ring. He said, "I wanted to call personally rather than leave this in the formal channel. The Hale matter's settled. Full disgorgement, maximum civil penalties. He's also facing parallel criminal referral from the DOJ, which is a separate matter, but the civil case is concluded." She said, "I understand." He said, "The settlement figure triggers your award. Final calculation will come through the Office of the Whistleblower, but I can tell you informally that the number will be significant." She said, "Thank you, Henry." He said, "You did everything right. From the start." She said, "I did what the system was designed for." He said, "A lot of people don't. Most people don't." She said, "I know." After she put the phone down, she stood at her kitchen counter for a moment. She thought about November 3 years ago, the cold coffee, the fluorescent hum of the empty floor, the specific dread of a number that did not add up. She thought about the USB drive she had taken home in her bag. She thought about Form TCR, the boxes she had filled in at 11:30 at night on her personal laptop, the submit button she had pressed in the quiet apartment. She thought about Diane sitting in an Aurelius and Crane conference room with 2 SEC investigators across the table, describing the invoices she had processed, the user access she had been given, the instructions she had received, or the decisions she had made. She thought about none of this for very long. She picked up her phone. She had a 9 o'clock call with the private foundation client about their grant disbursement tracking, and she needed to review the preliminary findings she had prepared before the call. She opened the document. She reached for her coffee, which was still warm. She would tell her mother eventually. Not yet. There was no version of that conversation she wanted to have before the legal matters were fully resolved, and her mother would not be capable of the neutrality that the conversation required. Elena Solis would want to cry and mediate and find a path back to something that looked like family coherence. And Mara was not interested in that path, not because she was unwilling to forgive in some abstract future sense, but because the architecture of what Diane had done was not the kind of thing that collapsed neatly into family dinner conversation. It would take as long as it took. For now, she had work. In the month following Henry Kwan's call, 2 things happened that she noted without dwelling on. First, a mention of the SEC enforcement action against Meridian Capital Group and Victor Hale appeared in a Financial Trade Publications Enforcement Roundup column, a 3-paragraph summary that named the primary defendant and described the ghost vendor scheme in general terms. It did not name the cooperating whistleblower because the SEC did not name cooperating whistleblowers in enforcement announcements unless requested, and she had not requested it. Second, she received a LinkedIn message from a woman named Karen Osei, a forensic compliance director at a New York-based asset management firm, who said she had read Mara's Journal of Financial Crime articles and was interested in exploring whether there was a fit for a consulting engagement. Karen Osei's firm had $2 billion in AUM and was expanding its forensic controls infrastructure. Mara replied to Karen Osei the same day. She took the call the following week from her apartment office, sitting at the desk with a legal pad and a pen and the clean, focused attention she brought to every new business conversation. The call lasted 45 minutes. Karen Osei was direct and analytically sophisticated, the kind of client Mara had been building toward. Someone who understood what she was buying because she understood the problem she was trying to solve. They discussed the scope. They discussed the methodology. They discussed the timeline. At the end of the call, Karen Osei said, "I've spoken with 2 other people in the forensic compliance field about this engagement, and your name came up from both of them, independently. That doesn't happen often enough that I take it for granted." Mara said, "I appreciate that. I think there's a strong fit here." Karen Osei said, "One more thing. I saw in your bio that you hold a CPA license in Illinois. Is that license current?" Mara said, "Fully current. I can provide documentation." She sent the documentation that afternoon. The license certificate with her full legal name, the IDFPR confirmation, the current registration period. Everything attached to her name was hers, had always been hers, would remain hers. Karen Osei sent a countersigned engagement letter 11 days later. The morning the letter arrived in Mara's inbox, she printed it and set it on her desk and made herself a second cup of coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter and watched the street below come alive with the particular energy of a Chicago morning. The delivery trucks, the cyclists threading between the parked cars, the woman with the dog again, same dog, same patient walk, same piece of sidewalk claimed and reclaimed as if routine were itself a form of permanence. Her phone rang. Henry Kwan's number. She picked up. He said, "The Office of the Whistleblowers Award determination is finalized. You'll have the official notification in the mail within the week, but I wanted to give you advance notice. The determination is 31% of qualifying sanctions." She did the math before he finished the sentence. She said, "Understood." He said, "Congratulations, Mara. This is a good outcome." She said, "Yes." She put the phone down on the counter. She poured the second cup of coffee.